And thank you so much, Kuai. That's actually a really helpful presentation. I'm sorry that I missed the presentations earlier, but I am in Kansas City, Missouri, the center of the United States. So I was sleeping while you all were busy working. But I think that Kuai's talk would be, is going to hopefully work well with the probably seemingly random set of comments that I'm going to make. And I took this, when Veronica asked me to do this, it's exciting to be able to participate as part of Abide, but also as somebody who's trying to, be part of a group who's thinking through all of these issues. Because for me, it feels like AI is just coming in so fast that it's like a tsunami of AI. Like I can't, it's just it's very hard to keep up with on a personal level, much more on a professional level. And so, the ideas that I'm just bringing to the table here are basically just things that I would think about, I think from my perspective as a geographer. So in some cases, they might overlap or be redundant in terms of what you all have already talked about. But hopefully not, or hopefully at least it will help us kind of have, more directions to have discussions in. And I do want to start off with the question of AI and kind of these trail cams and collecting data. It is personal. We were recently able to move to a new house where we live in the woods, and I was really excited to get my first trail cam and set that up. And I can tell you that last night we had white-tailed deer. We had who we call Mr. Floppy Ear Coyote. He seems healthy other than he has a floppy ear. He came through a couple times. We had raccoons coming through. We had opossums coming through. And who knows who else. Those were just the ones that got sent to me. And I also do have one of these bird feeding camera bird feeder, where it's like has the camera and the bird sitting there, and you can watch them come in, and it helps you identify the birds. And just from that personal perspective, it's so exciting every day to wake up and say, who came through the yard last night, and it feels like, oh, I'm getting to know what are the paths that they're using, who likes to go this way, who likes to go that way, what birds are coming through the yard right now. And it kind of, and then when I'm sitting down to think about this, kind of all of the rest of it of like, what are we doing? Why are we doing? How is this stuff made? Kind of, comes to the fore. And it's such a mixed bag for me in terms of how to think about this and what we're doing. So, it's both a personal and a professional interest here. And I think from a geographic perspective, I wanted to kind of raise three general ideas that are shaping my way of thinking about what's going on with AI. And I am somebody who comes from much more of a qualitative background. So, I don't have a biology background. Most of my research methods are archival or interview based or content analysis based. And, so I don't have a lot of background in quantitative analysis or statistical analysis. And this is forcing me to also really kind of re-engage with those kinds of practices. And even if that feels like a struggle at this point in time, it's just learning new things, right? So I think I'm just going to kind of put my ideas out there, and we can see what lands. And I wanted to start off by thinking about or talking about the concept that comes from Bill Lynn, who's a fellow animal geographer, and he has a concept called geoethics, and that is something that he developed a couple decades ago, but it has really shaped the way I approach thinking about animal geography. And geoethics is really about situated understandings of moral problems, that we put kind of the place context at the center of how we're thinking about what becomes the ethically right or wrong or ambivalent choice to make, and how do we then work through that. So for me, it's been a very helpful framework because in part, the concept of geoethics is already very well applied by the Abide team and how everybody is thinking about the different aspects of the research, because we're already recognizing that non-human animals are part of the entire discussion, that we're trying to figure out how do we maintain that throughout. And that's one of the core tenets. And the second thing is this idea of equal consideration. How do we make ethical decisions if we're trying to take non-human animals, humans, fauna, political systems, if we're trying to give equal consideration to everybody, what does that look like? And for Bill, it doesn't look like that we're trying to, compromise, or that, in some cases, decisions might be made that benefit animals, that benefit humans, that benefit water systems, but that we're actively trying to think through all the different stakeholder positions. And again, Abide is already doing that. I think the third idea is this idea of hard cases. And that's where I think that there's, where this project really comes in, because we're thinking about, where the project is operating across countries in very different contexts, looking at the same topic. But how are these places different? How are these places the same? And does it shape the kinds of ethical decisions that are made on the ground because of the different locations? So the reason that I find this is really important is because of this idea of consent, as Kuai was just talking about. Like we haven't really figured out a very good way to get consent from animals. Do we do that just by human deliberation? Do we do that in partnership with indigenous communities or on the ground conservation groups or other political entities that have a vested interest in the animals in these spaces? And the animal's idea for privacy itself, I think, is also another thing that kind of becomes one of these hard cases. And so if I'm going back to my own trail cam, I didn't ask anybody if it was okay to put the trail cam around the tree. I didn't get a signed consent form from the squirrels or the raccoons, right? I just assumed, hey, this is fun for me and it's not really harming them. But again, how am I supposed to be working with that? How is it different in the privacy of my own yard versus doing a larger research project? And we do know from research by conservation biologists and others that that a lot of species do have a sense of privacy and they do make decisions. As Kuai says, they might find a camera and recognize it as something weird in their environment and choose to avoid it, right? So they are active agents in their own ways. And how do we kind of figure that process out, on the ground, depending on which species we're going to be in Brazil or Portugal or Australia that are going to be looked at in this project. And finally, Bill is also concerned with this idea of the moral carrying capacity, that when we're trying to make ethical decisions, we are thinking about this larger question of, kind of the good of the planet for everybody, multi-species flourishing for the present time and also for the future time. And again, I think Kuai was raising a lot of those issues when he's talking about just the computer power that's needed for some of these AI applications. I'm going to circle back to that in just a minute. So when we're thinking about geoethics and thinking about the place-based context of what's going on in this project, it might be something that gets talked through in each specific field site, right? And how do we kind of move through the place-based ethical questions, as well as kind of just these larger questions of right and wrong or good and bad, and what are we doing? And one of the things that came up specific to this project too, is in trying to understand how animals are recovering from these post-wildfire landscapes is how are we incorporating who these animals were before the fires? And because again, that's part of thinking about the place-based context of, what might be a right or wrong choice in this instance. Were people moving through these landscapes on a regular basis? Were these species used to, interacting with humans in different ways? Were camera traps or audio detective equipment already there, that they were kind of part of their daily environment? And because again, if we can trace some of those narratives out in place, then that also may help us, get to what we feel would be right or wrong results in a particular context. So I think that geoethics comes in because it provides this situated way of thinking about what's right and wrong, that as a project, we don't have to make determinations that this will apply in all of the field study sites, right? That just might not be the case. And that's okay, as long as we're kind of training, as long as we're providing that roadmap of our thinking and decision-making along the way. So the second point that I want to make comes from a paper by Jonathan Turnbull and several other colleagues from 2022. And I will go ahead, once I'm done talking, I will just kind of in the chat, I'll upload some of these papers that I'm talking about for people if anybody has an interest in looking at them. But I really appreciated their analysis of kind of what they call digital ecologies, which is basically all of the ways that, you know, our lives now are digitally entwined, and especially in terms of how this is impacting human, non-human animal relations. And so digital ecologies is really just this idea that we're all living inside these digital ecosystems now. And, you know, and it's sort of like, I do think of them as the picture that Kuai put up, where it's just like the lone person wandering through these canyons of, you know, computer towers and everything like that. And it feels very dystopian, right? Until you get the ping that, hey, Mr. Flappy Ear Coyote has come through your yard again, you know, and then I'm back into like, oh, happy mode about it, right? So being embedded in these technologies, you know, it's, how do we think about it while being inside of it? And you know, it's kind of like an interesting geographic question too, but they kind of have developed a nice framework that I think is also helpful for the team to consider. And it consists of three parts: ideas about materialities of digital ecologies, ideas about how digital ecologies impact our encounters with other species, and what does this mean for governance and policy? And so I'll just kind of take those in turn. And building on this idea of the materialities, you know, in geography, we have this term, the commodity chain, which I think is a pretty common term that we all understand, you know, that we can all probably understand, like what does it actually mean to produce a commodity? What is the full range of geographic space that's used from production to end? And again, building on what Kuai was talking about, when we're thinking about the computing power, the water usage, the extraction of raw minerals, I mean, the entire commodity chain of whatever we need to get to trail cams, to get to being able to store gigabytes, and I don't know, he said like words past gigabytes that I hadn't even heard before, right, of data. You know, how does something like that lend itself to understanding the carbon footprint of the kind of research that we're doing in today's world? Is using this better or worse than the carbon footprint is if we sent 10 researchers from Portugal and flew them to Australia for a certain amount of time? Does thinking through the commodity chain of this type of research method help us arrive at an ethical decision about what may be right or wrong in a specific circumstance? And, you know, these extraction economies, I think, are a big part of what we're thinking about in AI, because, you know, it's not only the extraction of what data is getting swept up in these different programs, who is actually managing that data, who ultimately has access to that data, but it is also about on the ground resource extraction. And if we're looking at, you know, wildfires and increasing weather issues related to climate change, maybe this is part of something that we're thinking about and trying to at least start to acknowledge in our research. So the second point they're talking about in terms of encounters, and how does the digital world help us encounter other species? And, you know, I'm thinking of the people that had to analyze the data of all of the pig oinks. First of all, it sounds like a lot of fun to collect data like that. And, you know, thinking through like, what are pigs communicating? But I think that what Turnbull and et al. Are getting at is we have to think a little bit further or a little bit more deeply about some of these encounters, and which animals are we choosing to encounter? Which animals are we highlighting? Are we focusing on those charismatic species? Or are we focusing on something like ants or grasshoppers, or, the kind of that background insect bird biophony that Kuai was talking about. And one of my concerns when I think about this, and I think about how we digitally encounter the animals, there's a couple of paradoxes that it's like I'm not really quite sure what to do with right now. But the paradox of the species versus the individual. If we're thinking about using the camera traps and you're counting, the number of coyotes, for example, that are moving through the camera traps, like, are we trying to distinguish? Is this the same coyote? Is this multiple coyotes? What is the benefit or purpose or reason why we might choose to just count the species itself, or to try and access some semblance of the individual animals themselves? Because digitally, there's these paradoxes where we can kind of get more intimate with the animals, in the sense that we see them. The camera traps, for example, or the sounds might, catch them in moments where they're unaware that they're around. But it also makes us more, they're more abstracted, because it's easier for them to just then become numbers. And so if we're thinking about a project where we're trying to, think of multi-species ethical responses or multi-species policymaking, we're working with this simultaneous abstract and yet intimate version of it. And so how do we disentangle that? And we're getting closer to the animals themselves, but also distant. I mean, we can sit here, the camera traps can be in Australia, and we can see them just, right now on the screen or something like that. Or they could be in Brazil somewhere. And so, but are we really getting closer? Are these technologies helping us to understand or to encounter animals in a different or a more comprehensive or more engaged manner? And I think, there's not a right and wrong here, but it's how are we thinking about it and how are we approaching it? Because if we're using AI to just see this counts or see the species as just these abstracted dots on a scatter chart, which again, great chart, it's not a criticism, right? But does that actually help us get to the experiences of the non-humans themselves? Would we do the same thing? Would we set up camera traps for the humans that lived in these communities and say, oh, well, there was a fire and now, 10 humans have walked by, and create the same type of analysis for the humans that we're doing with the non-human species? And so there's just, some openings there for trying to have a little bit more nuanced understanding of how we're approaching these different cases. And finally, when it turns to governance, Kuai also pointed out that some of the early, the early electronic systems for monitoring animals do come out of the military industrial systems. And being able to take those, I think that it is important for us to be aware of that lineage, and to acknowledge that lineage. Not, again, that doesn't mean it's right or wrong that we're using it today, but it also means that there's like a certain mindset, or a certain right, or some sort of ethical decisions that have already been made, that it is okay to use technology on or for animals in these particular ways. And this links to a lot of work in geography on the surveillance state. And our lives are so surveilled right now. One of the hard things is you feel like the world can know anything about me that it wants. Like it's like I feel like I no longer even have control of that, no matter how much I try to kind of, do the privacy settings or figure these kinds of things out. And so this idea of participating in furthering the goals of kind of like this capitalist surveillance state is something that I think we also need to grapple with, again, overall, not this project as it, just solely. But certainly I think that there's an opportunity to contribute to this discussion, right? Because we, we know that these kinds of methods can be incredibly helpful for tracking animals, but they're also used in a lot of other ways that I don't really think any of us would find acceptable, from a military or policing side, against other human beings. So, and that kind of leads me to thinking in terms of governance about how to manage the data in terms of what happens if the data gets in the quote wrong hands, or what happens if, we're training, like Abide is training other people how to use these techniques and they use them in a way that the Abide team feels is unethical, but, what control do we have over that, right? So again, not right or wrong answers here, but these are just kind of all the tendrils that I feel like, come into being part of this discussion. And in terms of the governments, if we're collecting all this data, where is the data going? How is it being secured? Again, this abstraction of the animals, right? The whole goal of all of our research, I feel like everybody that's attending today, is to try and figure out how to live in more deeply flourishing relations with other species. So do these technologies further that, or do they, in some cases, abstract from the animals and kind of remove a sense of reciprocity? And again, I'm not sure, these are just ideas that are coming up. And so kind of the last thing I think that I wanted to bring up is this idea of what methods do we need to develop as researchers that help us build ethical capacities for analysis. And I think that, the opportunity here for Abide is really huge, because as Kuai was pointing out, a lot of people are struggling with this, but it's all happening so fast that we're doing it and thinking about it. And so again, the Abide team has an opportunity to participate in that too. And so if we're thinking about these methods, a couple things that I think could be interesting ideas to consider, and maybe this builds on some of the work that Kuai does too, more as a visual artist. But one thing that came to my mind is notions of counter mapping. I mean, one of the reasons that we're looking at AI and trying to figure out how we can understand how non-humans respond in wildfires or other natural disasters, we're kind of thinking of collecting the data and mapping it, if you will. But what if we think about that in reverse? What would be the counter maps? If we were going to ask the animals themselves to map something, what might they ask? What would the indigenous peoples that we're working with, what would they ask? What would they map? And how could we do some sort of, reciprocal imaginative work here to help us think through some of those things? So counter mapping might be, just an interesting kind of brainstorming method to try and think through some ethical questions. Some other types of role-playing exercises may also be helpful, where we are, again, putting ourselves in the perspectives of other species, different locations, and building out narratives and asking questions and kind of in role-playing these issues through in more of a storytelling manner, right? And finally, I was thinking that, there may be an opportunity to create some sort of kind of like a stoplight grid, like red meaning, okay, like you're kind of over in like a dangerous ethical area, yellow, you're kind of, in a good, like in a decent space, but we're slowing down a little bit, and green might be like, okay, we're a go here. We've made a good decision here. And thinking about what would such a grid or a table or some sort of visual process for analysis look like, where we're starting to develop the questions that we might need to ask in different ways. If we start with the idea of the materialities, what is the carbon footprint of doing all of this, right? What are we extracting in order to be able to get this information? If we're thinking about questions about governance, right? How is the data stored? Where is it going? What happens if somebody gets a hold of it? What happens if Elon Musk gets a hold of it? Who knows, right? And again, not to like set up something that's going to work in all cases, but as a way to sort of help really visualize when we're talking about ethics and AI in these contexts, that we're really talking about a whole geography of kind of ethical questions and ethical conundrums and actually real world implications. So, you know, it's been really interesting to be part of this process and to kind of, you know, start thinking about all these kinds of questions and everything myself, because like I said, it's not, you know, I haven't used these tools for research with animals. But I'm hoping that these sorts of questions might be able to kind of open up discussion, or might be able to link to what people were talking about this morning, and, you know, just and help further the discussion that's happening here. So I think those were all of my random thoughts for today. So I'm going to just kind of end my presentation. And while we're talking, I will post some of these other questions. Thank you, Philippa, for whichever one you posted right there, but I'll try and get those other ones up there too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie, for these inspiring and very comprehensive notes and reflections. They were very inspiring. Let's start the discussion. So if you agree, I'll start to collect the questions. You can either speak, and muting yourselves, raise your digital hands if you want to do so, or else place your questions in the chat. I'll be happy to collect them and read them if you're in a situation that you can't read them yourselves. I can start by trying to draw some lines between the two presentations and the two. I won't be exhaustive for sure, because they were both so rich and we have so many different layers of discussion. But I can start by highlighting three that were more salient to me. On the one hand, all the question about the capitalist surveillance state and surveillance society, and actually the capitalist nature of all this new reality of AI, and behind the market value, to use an expression that Kuai used, or capitalist surveillance as Julie used, the expression used by Julie. And all this going back to the quid bono question: who does this benefit, and where are the interests of animals considered in all this, and what is our role as researchers in keeping these interests of animals first and foremost as a priority in our practice, which is not only the practice of the research we're doing now, it's also about considering the impacts, as Julie was just now saying. If we in the Abide project are going to train the new researchers and the upcoming researchers to use something that then goes out in to be used to not in the best interest of animals, what will be our responsibility on that side? So all this question about the capitalist interests behind the AI, and the quid bono question, and how to protect animals, it's here for us to continue to discuss. Then another thread I could pull through both presentations was this importance of place-based and context-based research questions and ethical questions. So research and ethics together, weave together in context and in place-based questions. And also to retrieve something that Melissa said in the morning, when she was commenting on our lack of capacity as social researchers in curating our qualitative data to be available in archives. It also goes back to this, it's difficult when we do that to preserve the context. But what is it for us in qualitative data if not a context? Like data in itself just gains meaning in context. So if we lose context, it's almost about losing everything. So this importance of keeping the context, and how we can how this artificial intelligence new debate and technology, how does this hinder our capacity to keep ourselves in context? And a third line across the two presentations I would highlight just for now, just to keep to three, would be this importance of working with the communities, both the indigenous communities, human communities, and the animal communities that also dwell in those environments, as a way of recognition, so acknowledging not only their ontologies and epistemologies, but also of how can we work with them in order to reflect their interests also, so their best interests, and how AI is helping or not in this process. So maybe as to start the conversation, I would highlight these three threads. And I'm checking the chat to see if there are any questions. It's Julie. Thank you, Julie, for sharing. Very nice to hear you about the text that you were mentioning. That we discussed that text in one of our reading groups. Philippa from the Abide Project discussed that one tandem with another one about a fox, which actually it's a fourth thread I could also pull out of both your presentations. It's this need that we in the project are feeling, and I'm sure more of us here share this concern in addressing the subjectivity, the subject, animal subject, not only the species. And in that text about a fox from Tom Fry, which was, the text is called Tracking Sonny. I'm not sure it's there already, so I'm going to post the link. I think that this text addresses a little bit one way of doing this, also together with the communities, because it's a participative project. And for us in the project, that because we are also thinking of working, as Kuai explained, with wildlife, so particular spots of wildlife, this becomes even more challenging in a way, and also depending on the species, of course. Yes, Melissa.
Yeah, sorry, because I'm going to have to log off in a bit. If I could just jump in. It was really lovely I really enjoyed both of your presentations, Kuai and Julie. And they sparked a lot of thoughts also in trying to link the discussion from this morning as well. I mean, one thing specifically with the Abide project that I think it's worth remembering that, I mean, we're here to discuss the possibility of using AI for analysis because there's lots of data, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that was my understanding in the starting point, but of course that's not your only method. And so thinking about this from a kind of multimodal perspective, and thinking about, you know, because one of the things I mentioned a project that I had worked on with computer scientists this morning, where we had taken eco maps. So that's kind of drawing relationships, but those, when you draw an eco map, you don't do that. You're not just drawing lines in silence. A conversation evolves around that, and an eco map is schematic. And so because you're not just doing the video, the motion tracking, you're doing a lot of other things. And so I guess for me, the question, two things. One, the conversation might also then move on to thinking about how do we bring these methods together? And that's about analysis. It's as much about analysis, but it's also storytelling. It's like, what do we get from each of the methods? How do we, I'm trying to avoid using the word triangulate because that's not what I mean, but it's kind of how do you get that multi-perspective and what story do you tell from that? And AI within that is only a very thin strand. And the other thing that really kind of, the note I took is like, at no point do we relinquish or give up the sociological imagination and all of this. And that was sparked, you know, by something that you said, Julie, in terms of the kind of the counter cartographies or the role playing, the narratives. And, you know, whether it's that's taking the animal position, whether that's, you know, working with the indigenous communities, whether it's taking the position of the trees or the, you know, whatever the, you know, I'm thinking also Kathleen Stewart, the atmospheres, all sorts of things, you know, and this is why I'm quite, I think I'm more on the skeptically optimistic side of all of this, because I think we need to remember that we have very, very good tools. We are robust in these processes in ways that perhaps I don't know about other kind of knowledge communities, but I think we are very robust. And I don't think we should downplay. I don't think we should not be critical, but I think we need to also kind of from a strengths perspective, remember what we're good at and hang on to those tools. AI is not going to come and kind of, you know, and this is the bit about, you know, doing all of this in the moment of huge moral panic and political upheaval and all of that. We can't let go of that kind of, you know, of what we know to do really well and have been doing for 150 years, if not more, you know, that's not in question. So just kind of, you know, just, yeah. I guess those are the thoughts but I think the more practical thing in terms of thinking about how you bring these things together and remembering that the AI is only just one bit of your knowledge sense-making processes.
Thank you, Melissa. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for bringing that to the table. Kuai?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Thank you for your contribution and for hanging on throughout the afternoon, also waiting for this and your comments. Very clever. I think that there is so many things also that we can exchange, and I also want to thank Julie for bringing so many ideas. Well, let's not exaggerate, but very poignant ideas that are important for us and will be, I'm sure, important for us in the Abide project internally to discuss and disentangle with our own concepts and ongoing projects and ideas for writing and also for the fieldwork. I also would like to say from the points I would like to also bring on the table for discussing with you, maybe, and this is just maybe I will want Filipa and maybe Chiara, if when I talk about things that I think maybe they can also help me formulate or perhaps reformulate. Especially, I must say, Chiara, for instance, is about to go into fieldwork, so it's a very exciting moment for her. I imagine also perhaps also overwhelming as she's going, so that you know, to the quilombolas in Brazil. So it's a completely different environment from this room setting, indoor discussion, made available by making this meeting by Zoom, right? And that is also something that we need to acknowledge, the possibility that we have to be so distant and still collaborate together. And also wanted to mention to maybe pass the word to Filipa very briefly, no stress, because when Julie was talking about this idea of counter mapping, I really thought about what we've been briefly also exchanging with Filipa about this, the more than human mapping that we would like to try out in the project. And I just wanted to bring that up because I think that it might interpolate and intersect some of the things that Julie shared with us. And perhaps she can also talk a bit more about that. But also someone that I'm not sure, I don't think Isadora is with us, right?
Yes, she is.
But yeah, so I mean, Julie may know already because you have discussed things about the project with Veronica, I imagine, but the main focus in the Brazilian case is the Xerente community in the Cerrado, in the savannas of Brazil. And while we are intending to, just saying this is a very real case scenario that we will confront, and thanks to Isadora, our member being based there and having been there twice already. And we have already an idea of what to expect, both in terms of what she shared with us in his photographs and the interviews and the journal that she wrote, the field notes. And it's very, very rich and very, very complex. And I'm just saying this to connect the idea of what we would like to try is this more than human mapping, as is one of the initial offerings of the project, of the Abide project, is to kind of have these 3 large bioregions in the planet, Australia, Portugal, and Brazil. And initially we thought about the map, right? Where we have this map where these resilient species live and how they cope with the pre-fire and post-fire events. We still haven't solved that in how we can employ, whether it's AI, whether it's the many other tools that are there for geographic information systems that I'm also experimenting with artistically. And then, of course, there is this quantitative, quantitative output when you use any of these tools. But how do you translate that to share with the main stakeholders in the case of the Xerente, or in the case of the Quilombolas, which is the other community that Chiara is going to work with. The thing is that it adds onto this complexity of not only how language is being used to train AI or data as the main input to use these kind of tools for analysis, but also how then we would like to also involve not only the animals, but the people that are in their own territory and know these animals better than ourselves. And then I think this counter mapping, I wanted to ask Julie if she thinks, is there a difference that comes to her mind when I mention more than human mapping to counter mapping? Because one of the things that I also thought about Isadora, and that's what I would like a bit of feedback. And maybe, Filipa and Chiara and also Isadora can join into this. If that could be useful to have this kind of other ways of mapping the animals, or if there is a way that we can facilitate this mapping, because Isadora also had this idea of running workshops with the Xerente, where these maps are drawn not by ourselves, not by the graphical systems technology or by AI or any other tool, but how they perceive locally their savanna, their territory, how they perceive the animals they witness or they come into contact. I imagine that also could be interesting to explore. And then I wonder if the modern human mapping is just another coin term that sounds interesting for us scholars at the moment, or if there is a truly way to make it happen and claim it and own it. If the animals themselves are not carrying sensors, I wonder how, just by using trail cameras, which, by the way, it's a very clever way to turn things around. We use camera traps as a word, but I like the idea of trail cameras, right? Then you're not trapping. As camera trapping already in the language implies this kind of like capturing. It's also good to be wise and think about the words we choose to explain this. Again, in other languages, thinking about Xerente and Quilombolas in Portuguese, they speak also their own languages. And this is a very huge bridge to try to build in terms of how do we share the knowledge that we own with our technologies, whether it's creative, artistic in my case, or specific biological, ecological, even technological, so that we can empower these communities, which are the ones I think should benefit from this more than human mapping or counter mapping.
Julie, do you want to?
Yes, sure. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So to Kuai's question, is more than human mapping the same thing as counter mapping? I mean, I think that, it depends on the context. I mean, the idea of more than human mapping is, I mean, I think it's been done in a couple different cases in terms of trying to map like the animals as individuals or as a species in a more creative way. So I think it would be kind of a subsidiary, I guess, of counter mapping. I mean, counter mapping is much more of a participatory process. It's really been used to kind of do a lot of challenging of kind of traditional, you know, colonial mapping or any sort of kind of like dominant discourse or dominant way of looking at the world. And again, that counter mapping can look very different depending on the context. There's, I think, a lot of interesting work being done just in the area of creative mapping itself. So there's creative mapping, there's counter mapping, and then we have more than human mapping. And if you're thinking about working with these communities, you know, I mean, I think it would be really fascinating if they were going to create maps, what would they choose to map, you know, without us, you know, telling them what they would want to map, you know, giving them the parameters and let them talk the team through what they think. And those might be hand-drawn maps, you know, those might be, you know, they might decide, okay, well, we could interact with hand-drawn maps on like a GIS map that gets produced or something. And, you know, making maps of the different marks that animals make around the trail cams, like along the routes, like what, you know, like if we're doing counter mapping, what could we map from the animals themselves in different ways, perhaps. And so again, I'm not trying to add more work to this already huge project, right? But you know, I think there's an opening to kind of think through those parts. And if we think kind of down the road in terms of what could this type of counter mapping or more than human mapping contribute, you know, I mean, I think contributing, you know, the ownership of the participation with the groups that you all are working with, but, you know, these maps also become very fascinating narratives in and of themselves. And for, you know, dissemination to the larger public, to different institutions, they become really powerful storytelling vehicles, you know, kind of, you know, that synthesize a lot of this data versus kind of showing just the actual like analysis of the data itself. So I think that there's, you know, immediate and downstream impacts that could be, you know, very unique in terms of this project. And even what would local people's maps look like in the different places, right? I mean, you know, there's just a lot of place-based analysis that could go on here. So it feels really exciting as an artist. I don't know, I would, you know, I'm sure you could envision like a lot of different brainstorm a lot of different possibilities for these kinds of things. But there could be a real power here to be able to balance the use of AI with other types of, you know, more creative mapping to produce kind of this, you know, some kind of hybrid work, right? Where as Melissa was saying, we already do a lot of things really well. So how can we bring all of these pieces together?
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. Before passing it on to Chiara, who raised her hand as well, just like to say that you're not really adding extra work to the Abide project, because this is actually one of the lines of inquiry of the project from the beginning. So we were set to do what I called back then a geographical mapping, more on the basis using GIS and using input from the animals, traces left behind that we, the team, could collect ourselves, and with the communities in a kind of citizenship science sub-project. This initial project is not completely set aside, but since Filipa entered the project, she's the human geographer in the team, and she's added this idea very close to what you described as counter mapping, which is very, very interesting and creative. And so, yeah, definitely, Filipa, namely, she's already on track on that line of inquiry, and we look forward to continue this conversation with you, because I think it's very interesting, both as a brainstorming, you called it a brainstorming method, and I think it's really interesting. It's also a speculative method. What would the animals? What would be the maps of the animals if they could draw it or have an interest in drawing it themselves? And for sure, as a dissemination tool, is very helpful too, and as a participatory tool with the communities, then engaging, for instance, in education programs with the children. That's interesting to use as well. So thank you also for that part. So I'll pass it on to Chiara now. Chiara?
Hi, thank you so much for your talks, Julie and Kuai. So just, can you hear me first? Because instead of keep speaking, I'm gonna ask. I just wanted to say something about in a moment, Julie, you talked about the fact, the question was, are we really getting closer through technology to animals, or this is allowing us to keep a certain distance? And I found the question very interesting because it made me think of the way sometimes technology is also used as an alternative and not as a complementary methodology to engage with the people living in multi-species relationships with these animals. And so it's a real way to kind of distance ourselves as researchers, not only from the animals, but also from all these relationships that are going on the field. And I think this is also connected to what Kuai was saying, in the sense that if we're going to field work, I'm just thinking about methodologies, but I think I'm not deciding anything before going to the field and talking with the people there, because I think it's something that you have really to work to get together with the community and to understand the limits and so on. And so it's a conversation that we are keep having in our team for these reasons. And also you mentioned, of course, also you mentioned the use that this technology may have, and the fact that it's kind of outside our control, not only the data, but the further developments that we don't have, we can even imagine how far it will go in a certain way. And it made me think of a book I'm reading, Loss and Wonder at the World's End, because it talks about also the issues with conservation and how these technologies are often used in biology conservation projects, not only in contrast with the indigenous communities' interest, but also in a very militaristic way, in the sense that we know about culling, we know about all these other practices. And so it's really always important to keep, I think, these alternative uses in mind when we approach these technologies. And I won't say much about mapping and counter mapping because it's more of a Philippa field. So I will leave the word to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chiara. So for those of you who don't know, Chiara also works in the Abide project. Some of us are identified with the logo, some are not. So I'm stating this just for those that may be in the room. Chiara is doing her PhD in the project, and she's about to leave to Brazil to do her first field work with the Quilombolas communities, as Kuai mentioned also. Also in the room from the Abide project is Philippa. Philippa is identified as I am with the logo, and Sara also works in the project, and Kuai, of course, that you already know, and Isadora. Isadora is also here with us. Isadora is our anthropologist in Brazil. She's doing field work, ethnography with the Xerente community, an indigenous community in Cerrado in the state of Tocantins. So I don't know if there are any questions in the chat or comments also. They don't have to be questions. Triggering issues.
I think, could I go ahead and jump in?
Yes.
I think that there's a couple things that, just kind of, I was thinking about as everybody's been talking. And, one of the things that I was thinking about with all of the AI is, okay, sorry, let me try and formulate a functional sentence here. So things like ChatGPT, one of the big conundrums is that, you know, all of these AI systems are being trained on all sorts of material. And so there's all sorts of copyright issues. I mean, they're getting trained on like our data, private data, people's other published work, their artwork and everything. And so the copyright questions, I think, are really interesting. And what it makes me think about in terms of the opportunities with a project like this, and thinking about what can we do with the data that we're collecting and what we're asking to in essence take from other species, whether it's their vocalizations, whether it's their scat, whether it's images of them, is really authorship. Right? I mean, is there a way that we can actually have other species be the authors, co-authors on reports, co-authors on papers, in the way that we would have possibly like the local communities be co-authors on specific papers or specific works, to recognize that reciprocity of taking and giving, and that they are actually contributing to what's going on. So, you know, because that is one of the things that feels so slippery about things like ChatGPT. If you're just using it to type, you know, to type something in or check the grammar of your paper, okay, that's fine. But if you're asking it real questions, you are taking from somebody else's knowledge, and that is unacknowledged. So it's like, not only you know, is this project an opportunity to try and work with new ways of understanding or communicating or gathering data from other species, but we could also turn that around in terms of authorship too, and that, you know, and give some kind of agency in that capacity. Would that work? Would, you know, journals accept something like that? You know, I don't know, but it certainly is kind of could be part of the discussion about all of this. And, you know, the other thing that comes up in terms of thinking about kind of analogous type of work is that when I think about like animals trying to survive in these kind of post-disaster locations, I mean, in essence, they're refugees just as much as the humans are, right? And so the language around, you know, refugees and mobilities and care, you know, and mapping, like what does it mean that an animal loses its home, that it loses its place identity? We know that has a detrimental impact on people, whether they're forced to leave for natural disasters or through war or something like that. And so again, I think, you know, there is some interesting opportunity here, and it seems like a lot of interesting discussion with the communities around, you know, what their experiences of how their place identity or place attachment have, you know, stayed the same or shifted or changed or gotten better or worse. And, you know, that might allow them to move into discussions of, well, how do they think that that's been impacting on the non-human animal world? So again, I'm just kind of adding more ideas to the pile, right? But so yeah, I'll just leave it at there.
Definitely. Those are ideas. Thank you, Julie, for bringing them up. And those are ideas that we're also been discussing in the project. Maybe Chiara wants also to jump in at some point about these refugees, the idea of a refuge and how we can build on that, and how can we better know the experience and reach out to the experience of the animals on that side. Thank you. And I see that Kuai raised his hand. Do you want to jump in, Kuai?
Yeah, just excited to continue that conversation or that topic of animals as authors, co-authors. And I was wondering, connecting to also something that you previously mentioned, Julie, in the sense regarding the, for instance, with the example of trail cameras, right? And you're excited in your own new home or where you are living, and in your experience in the surrounding that you are already aware of and know how to navigate across and through. Then you know the cameras, and then you are already visually adjusted to this. I don't know, I don't recall exactly which animal did you say that. I think it was the fox, or I don't remember if it's the opossum, but that some of those individual animals that perhaps already appear more than once, that you already are used to see, and then you name them, let's say, at a distance. Of course, they will not react as a pet, but you learn to recognize it through the lenses of the lenses of the chip that is wired in the circuit of the camera and transmitted over your wireless network, which you can save or not save in your local hard drive. But that's an individual that we humans, I think that's one of the greatest challenge when me coming from working with what I love and always will praise is the ants being anonymous. That's a great privilege they have. It's unless they are in a lab, then we briefly touch upon that with bees, with Niko in the first panel, but the fact that in terms of control environments, you can paint or tag, mark basically insects in order to not name them, but at least identify them and know, okay, she came back from the nest, she returned from gathering pollen, etc., etc. The same is with ants. This is a well expanded and broad approach to mark insects. But if you don't have them in the lab setting, insects are very anonymous. You cannot name them as you name a pack of wolves. Even if you have a drone, and there's plenty of natural documentaries, as we all know, high quality imaging, the lives of these packs, not only of wolves, of elephants, and we as humans visually get attached to those individuals. We are very hard, and that's what AI is good for, to discern, once the parameters are set, one individual from another. For us, if we see a bunch of ants, we cannot distinguish them. It's very hard. Even, with a pack of wolves or with a herd of other animals, we could, once you see a 1-hour documentary, because there's a voice that narrates. So what I'm saying is that I think it's very, very difficult, and I wonder how can we solve this. I just hypothesizing, if we follow an individual in a fire-prone area site that we want to study, if there is a way that we can work, I'm just extrapolating with one of the dogs. Let's say there is a dog from the fire brigade of the IBAMA or the ABIX, which is the local fire brigade in the Xerente land, that they own a dog that goes with them. And it's their dog. They know their character. They know this dog. And we follow that dog because it's part, or they follow them dog. And then it can help, let's say, expand this more than human or counter mapping through the movements, not even the eyes of that dog somehow. That is a companion species. I wonder, how can we make animals co-authors or authors if they are not individualized, if they have no names, and if they are not companion species? Because a wild animal, I think it's very difficult to give authorship. And if we go about with multi-species approaches, then how the hell do we name all the group of species that we want to evolve? I wonder, how do we acknowledge and credit authorship to animals if they don't have names?
So does anybody else have a comment? Because I'll jump in again. So yeah.
Yes, you jump in.
Okay.
I have a comment, but I can do it after.
Okay. I think that's I think that's a really fascinating question. And I think it really gets to the heart of kind of this idea of the situated ethics, right? It's like not only are we trying to think about the situated ethics of 3 field research sites, but now we're thinking about the situated ethics of relationships with specific species in one particular research site, right? Ants, ants are really fascinating creatures, even if we can't individualize them. And I think that my initial response would be, anything that you did to convey the experiences, whatever that might look like for ants, or any insect, is really going to be very fascinating, because again, this is not a charismatic species. This isn't, like you said, one of the individuals like Mr. Floppy Ear Coyote. That's the guy that we have coming. I mean, I don't even know if he's a male or a female, right? Coming through our yard. But the idea that, you know, if there are, how would we handle that would be a huge question. I mean, I'm imagining like the idea of following the dog around. I mean, I think that's a really great entry point, right? Because you could think about, what is the dog even encountering? How many other species is the dog even encountering when they're going out and doing the work? And I'm also thinking of, again, creative mapping opportunities where, you know, like, are we, you know, putting down papers where ants could walk across and leave some kind of trail? Are we making casts of, like, you know, different kinds of marks that species like different insects might make in some capacities? And I'm not quite sure what kind of ants live, like how many would be like in a group, since I'm not sure what species you're talking about. But I think that, you know, there's a lot of creative opportunity here to even to get beyond and to access those kinds of questions. So I see it as an opportunity. And I think that if you're raising people's awareness about all other species, right? I mean, maybe the goal, like, what would be the goal? Which species are getting focused on in which particular research site and why is a huge question. I mean, you can't obviously tackle every single species that's there and try and map all the species that are there. So, you know, what are the reasons that the team is picking and choosing like certain species or certain individuals to focus on? There's no right or wrong, obviously. But in this particular case, it might be really fascinating. Well, what would it look like counter mapping for ants? Do they go around something? Do they go through it? Do they go above it? Like, they definitely respond and they adapt and they learn. I mean, I know that just from watching random, you know, nature shows about ants, right? So how could we take that further? And, you know, given that they're like a food source for the whole rest of the food chain, you know, it's like they would be a really important component to consider, even if they can't be considered as individuals. But again, that's part of thinking contextually about, you know, what's going on, and, you know, highlighting the dog and then highlighting like the species of ant as a whole. In that particular research site, it might have some profound implications to have all of those, to have those dialoguing with each other as both the species and the individual, because that's also what the project is trying to think through, I think, you know. So yeah, I just think it's like there's a lot of fun opportunity here. Okay.
Thank you, Julie. Oh. And we have an extra participant. I'd like to,
that's my, sorry, this is my old lady cat, and she's very old and she has to wear her sweater and she do whatever she wants. So apologies.
Sweet. No apologies needed. We love to have her here. I would just add a comment on the authorship, because I was thinking when you talked and also when Kuai shared that I still have some reserve. Maybe we would need to go back to what this authorship mean for us social scientists or visual artists, and is it the same meaning that we're giving to the word or not, and how can we redefine it or reinvent it in order to bring animals in as co-authors? Because what I was thinking was, and we were also discussing this in the morning, I think it was Melissa who mentioned that we social scientists in particular are very much biased still in terms of the data that we work with. We work very much with verbal data, so discourse, written discourse and oral discourse, and also in the outputs that we produce, they are written outputs, like it's a text. So acknowledging animals as co-authors in terms of the data we co-create together, I do agree, but as far as the written output, so to speak, so the final piece being a text, then I wonder where the animal is there, and if they agree or not, what the meaning that we gave to the material, how we weave the things together in an interpretation, if that would make sense for those animals or not. And so I was thinking that maybe we would need to reinvent even the outputs, rather than being written in verbal language, something closer to what Kuai does in his artistic work with visual. I think visual artists are doing this very well, and actually I think the breakthroughs are more there. I'm not saying that we can't find breakthroughs also in written pieces with words, like our traditional verbal language. But I must say that the work I've seen recently from visual artists, for me, it talks more about breaking these boundaries between our human language and non-human languages. And so I was thinking that, at least for now, where I stand now, it makes more sense making animals as co-authors in those kind of final outputs than in our traditional written pieces. I don't know what you think about this. This makes sense or not, but this is what I was thinking as you are sharing, both of you, on authorship, which I think is a critical topic for us, because it's a topic of recognition, right? In this case of the animals, but also of the communities we work with. But when the communities are human, it's even if we have to deal with translation issues and interest issues and coming to a common ground, we are still in the same kind of verbal language domain. When we are working with other communities other than human, we need to move beyond the verbal in order to try to reach to their ways of expressing themselves.
I may jump in. So one thing that I think goes even matches better this a possible path to walk together in terms of the methodology, and that we haven't discussed. And I think it goes a bit off the main title of the AI seminar, but and I'm scared also to talk about it because I think it might come to AI in a way that it could be possible to process as data, but it's not. And I think that also fits well with the idea of counter mapping or resistant intelligence, let's say, is the multisensory. So I actually don't think I am a visual artist. I rather would like, and that's also one of my interests with working with fire, is this multisensory aspect that is unaccounted for in fire, in wildfires. I mean, the smell, the aerosol particles that of course are nocive, toxic for us humans, and it's a very clear signal to keep away from fires or run, which is also for animals. And there is a parallel in that, in the rhythm of reading these signals that we share with animals. Even with ants, even with insects, they are very sensitive in terms of the olfactory. So one of the things I still have not produced for the Abide or work with, but it's of course, ongoing process, is exactly that multisensory experience, to try to somehow work with this, collecting pieces and bits of what has been burned, the barks of resilient trees, what is once pyrophilic, species, known pyrophilic insects, the ones that go to the fire, and how can you artistically, creatively represent their experience of fires without language, right? And that's why I started working with this false color spectrograms. And of course, my intention was not to analyze it in a quantitative way, but as a way of getting into this data analysis world, which I thought very fascinating. I took it as a challenge, and I think there are ways to re-represent that quantitative data of charts and histograms in a different way. But I do think that is something that might be very interesting with other communities, even with the people living in Cerro de Estrella. The point is how to engage in a practice that becomes participate, that they kind of
Kuai,
get your idea.
Kuai, we're
There
not
are
getting
besides
you. Can you hear me?
rational language, whether if there is a way to low. Hear me now? No?
I think you're back, but it got cut a little bit. Can you repeat the last sentence or so? Thank you.
Yeah, that if there is a way to engage the people in the sites, on the sites that we will be working cross-continental Portugal and Brazil in forms that beyond drawing maps or drawing experiences or interviewing them to tell us about the sensory experience in these places.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for pointing this important aspect of the multisensorial, which is actually what we're after. We're not just after images, still or moving images, but the multisensorial experience, also as a way of learning in an embodied way, what might be the experience of animals in these post-fire landscapes. Just a final round to the table to see if anyone has any question. If not, I think we could wrap it up here. If you agree, our presenters and Jussara also. And for that, Jussara, are you there? Yes, hi, welcome. And so shall we wrap it up here since we have no more questions? So I'd like to thank very much our presenters in the afternoon. Thank you, Kuai, for delivering a brilliant talk on the challenges and the opportunities for this topic in the Abide project. And also thank you, Julie, for your very, very inspiring comments and ideas and brainstorms. Now we are going to hear everything again and take notes and surely get back to you to discuss this further and all these ideas and how we can implement them better. Thank you also to the audience, those of you that stayed with us until the end of this one-day session. It's one day, but it's one day on Zoom, so it's quite a lot. So you were very resilient. Thank you for that. And thank you to Jussara. Thank you for organizing this with us. It was really a pleasure. And I will give you the floor, the three of you, if you want to say some words, some final words. And on my part, thank you very much. It was really, really nice and inspiring.
I will just say thank you so much. I learned a lot, both from the part of AI and from animal studies. So it's always a learning. And I think when you think about different from different perspectives and try to understand how they articulate, it's particularly productive and we learn a lot in this process of thinking beyond what we normally do in life. So it was, thank you so much for the invitation, Veronica.
Thank you for accepting and thank you all. So we'll be in touch and more to come because the Abide project is just not in the middle yet. So we still have a lot of road to run and we count on you also, Julie, to help us through it.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Veronica, for organizing this. It's great to be a part of such a community in this time of, I don't even know what's happening in my country or the world right now. I can't even speak to it. So thank you for all of you. Yes, very much.
Yes, our deep empathy with that. We are all very empathetic, and our full solidarity. And we hope this is a home for you, even if it's only virtual, that our community can be a home for all of us, and for you as well. So thank you, and speak soon. We'll be in touch.
Okay.